the recording. Hello and good morning from Lookout Mountain. We're continuing the media history portion. We're about halfway through it. We should finish with the 20th century and the internet next week. So it'll be the week after, because there's no spring break. It'll be around what would have been spring break, mid-March, for us to do the next test. I know it's a long unit, it's the longest one in the course, but there's been a lot of history. Today, we'll talk more about the 1800s, the 19th century. We should get through it, and we'll go do the 20th century next week. And I will have we will have a one question 5-point test for extra credit after the class. So that's what we're going to do. And I will start shortly. Okay, you can go chase things. Anyways, sharing the screen. One thing that we have that happened in the 1800s is photography. Photography made a big difference. Look at these pictures. These people are Revolutionary War veterans, people who fought in the 1770s and 1780s. You know, they're old, but they're real. These people fought with George Washington, and they're the real thing. So you can see the difference that that photography can make. It's not a drawing. These are real people. Here's some more old pictures. (1840s). It's a street, but it's real. We can see how people really lived. There's bank buildings. Ulysses S. Grant, the guy on the $50 bill, as a young man. The Mexican War, the one which we won California. Here they go. The war was real. Gives you a sense. Photography made things much more real. And another thing photography brought is emotion. You can see how people felt and thought. Here is short history of photography.
This is a quick look at how photography has developed. Photography is hinged on the discovery that if you poke a hole in the wall of a dark room, you create camera obscura. Light passing through the hole is projected upside down and retains color and perspective. The first historical mentions of camera obscura in pinhole photography are by ancient philosophers Mouzy, Aristotle, and Alhazen. In 1490, Leonardo da Vinci records detailed descriptions of camera obscura and uses it to trace stuff. By the 1700s, camera obscura devices are common, and there's evidence to suggest artists like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Caravaggio use them. Sketchy. In 1724, Johann Heinrich Schulze discovers that substances mixed with silver nitrate react to light. Sadly, the images fade soon after. Until one day in 1826, the world's first photograph is taken by Joseph Nicephore Niepce in France using a procedure called heliography. Voila!
That was the first photo ever. It's now living in the University of Texas at Austin. And he pointed it out of his window for 8 hours and printed it printed on a metal plate that he then burned, and it became a picture that we still have today.
This exposure takes several days, and you can see the sun lights up both sides of the building. After his death, Nietzsche's partner Louis Daguerre continues his work and creates the first practical photographic process in 1833, the daguerreotype. In 1839, the French government buys and declares
Okay. The first photography we call the daguerreotype, not the Niepce type. Niepce invented photography. Daguerre popularized it. He made it. He let people know about it. He made it practical. What he did was, again, take that plate and burn it. And then he had a show in Paris in 1839 and announced, voila, I have invented photography, and gave it to the French government. So everybody, and made it free. So everybody remembers Daguerre. Nobody remembers Niepce.
There's the daguerreotype free to the world.
Yes.
This is when cool stuff starts happening, like the first photo of a human. Although this exposure lasted around 7 minutes, a man was getting his shoes polished and was standing perfectly still, thus making history. This was also the first photo with soul. And of course, the world's first selfie is taken by a guy named Robert Cornelius. And human's gonna human. It wouldn't take long for nude photography to kick off too.
Yep.
In 1840, Henry Fox Talbot unveils the calotype, a process based on negatives that allows for paper copies to be made. However, Talbot tried to charge license fees for the calotype, so it didn't really catch on. Compared to Daguerre, whose name is now one of 72 names inscribed on the Eiffel Tower, Talbot spent his life fighting lawsuits and eventually gave up on photography. You could say Talbot became a bit negative in the end. It's also important to mention the contribution of Sir John Herschel, who published many essential research papers and coined the term photography, from the Greek words of light and drawing. By the 1850s, mobile photo studios were all the rage because photos had to be developed on site. Exposure times were about 3 minutes long, so people used neck braces and drugs to keep still. It's also why nobody smiled in early photos. What could be the world's first Photoshop occurs in 1861. The head of Abraham Lincoln is placed on a more noble body. The world's first color photograph is also produced. It's of a bow. In 1871, Richard Leach Maddox, who had an outstanding mustache, invents the gelatin dry plate. This means smaller cameras and no tripods necessary. Great success, old chap. Now, here's a cool story, bro. In order to settle the debate of whether all 4 of a horse's hooves ever simultaneously leave the ground, Englishman Edward Muybridge sets up 12 cameras with wire triggers in the path of a galloping horse. The world's first photo sequence proves that they do. In 1885, George Eastman, founder of Eastman Kodak, invents roll film. The first handheld camera, the Kodak, goes on sale in 1888. Why Kodak? Because Eastman just liked the letter K.
And he wanted to brand his product. And he wanted to say, what do I call my company? Clicking the camera. Kodak, it's the sound of a camera clicking.
The Kodak came preloaded with 100 exposures that needed to be sent back to the factory for processing and reloading when the roll was finished. Eastman takes mass market photography a step further in the early 1900s with the Brownie, an affordable box camera that introduces the concept of the snapshot. Lights employee Oscar Barnack builds the revolutionary 35mm Leica 1, which goes into production in 1925. The camera allows photographers to go mobile and capture the moment. Some of the most iconic images in history would later be taken on Leicas. The first single-lens reflex SLR camera arrives in 1949. And the first digital image is created from a scan in 1957. However, digital cameras would only arrive a little later, in 1975, when Steve Sasson, a young engineer working for Eastman Kodak, invents the first digital camera. But nobody at Kodak is interested in digital. Who wants to see their photos on a TV? Why change the profitable film photography formula? Too late. Kodak only later switches to digital in 2004 and files for bankruptcy in 2012. The digital revolution begins in the 90s. DSLRs, point and shoots. Photography had never been more accessible. Well, until the first mobile phone with a camera came out in 2000. Game changer. 15 years later, And modern smartphones now have insanely powerful cameras. In just seconds, we are able to capture every moment and share it online. Photography has become a global passion. It has truly brought the world closer together.
Yes. And the optics, the basic quality of a camera from a picture has not really changed since Daguerre's time. They've just gotten smaller and faster. Now we use phones far more than we use cameras, but it's still photography. And what does photography give us? Things more real. You see things in real time, what they really look like. It leaves little to your imagination. Brings emotion. You see what people look like. It's not just a description. Photography is an emotional, visceral, wow, look at that experience. You know, captures the moment in time. You know what things really look like, the time that they occurred. So it's a fairly big deal. Anyway, so that's photography. We will go back now. Those things start to come together. We went through a lot of these yesterday. The telegraph, a lot of it happens in the Civil War. All right.
With online newspapers, social networks, and television,
All right.
and more public news, newspapers were used. The newspaper industry itself evolved during the war and grew to be what it is today. Since the Civil War was supposed to be a short war, the demand for news was massive for the soldiers and the citizens. The people wanted to know how their side was doing. In order to meet the demand, rotary presses were invented. This type of printing press could provide papers for a whole city, opposed to a whole town in one night.
So people, and there's a lot more newspapers in the North than the South. You can hear what people in the North knew what was going on with the telegraph. You telegraphed who won the battle here in Chattanooga, and people would know immediately. It would be printed in the paper and they would know the next day.
Another way that information was spread was through photography. The camera was just emerging at the time of the Civil War. The process of taking and developing a picture took time and skill. It required two men quickly mixing trays of chemicals and pouring them over sheets of glass. Cameras were very large and would be set onto specially built wagons. Photography was a way for people to see the battlefield from a safe distance and preserve the historic scenes.
See what these people really looked like and felt like. Saw what the war looked like, including a lot of death.
The telegraph was the quickest way for information to be shared throughout the country. A battle in Georgia could be reported to Washington in a matter of minutes. Telegraph operators would follow the troops to the battlefront and set up telegraph poles and wires right where the action was happening. Using Morse code, a trained operator would send and interpret messages. This system allowed leaders to make decisions and relay them to the generals or commanders.
See, this is one of the things Lincoln and Grant was really good with. Here, I'll go back to that.
The telegraph.
See, if something was happening in Chattanooga, he would know, Lincoln would know right away. Grant was a supply officer. He could move his supplies from here, here, and here. Lincoln could see what the armies were doing all over. The South didn't have those many wires. They couldn't coordinate as well. They also had our local person, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who understood the importance of the telegraph, and he went around cutting telegraph wires.
Was the quickest way for him. Unfortunately, before the end of the war, the balloon program disbanded due to financial reasons. Balloons were a safer way to scout out an area, but were expensive.
So a lot of things happened during the Civil War. For some reason, I had the wrong link for the Gettysburg Address. Because there's something special about that. Give me a second.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, at Big Bend, Big Sandy, and the Big Sunflower River. From Bunker Hill, West Virginia, and Blue Springs, Tennessee, and Cairo, Illinois, to Golgotha Church, Georgia, and Christiansburg, Kentucky. At Citrus Point on the Cimarron River, and along Cowskin Bottom. At Pebbly Run and La Glorieta Pass, and Gettysburg.
I think if I had my choice of all the moments to be present at in that war period, it would be at Gettysburg during Lincoln's delivery of his speech. Maybe to have seen him craft those beautiful words, his marvelous healing words, and then deliver them. They were for everyone for all time. They subsumed the entire war and all in it. It showed his compassion for everyone, his love for his people. That's where I'd like to be.
On November 19th, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new Union Cemetery. The featured speaker was Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a diplomat, clergyman, and celebrated orator. The president had been invited almost as an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks. Everett spoke for not quite 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. A local photographer took his time focusing. Presumably, the president could be counted on to go on for a while. But he spoke just 269 words. He started off by reminding his audience that just 87 years had passed since the founding of the nation. And then he went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
There he is.
He felt that he had failed, that it was a poor speech, that the people didn't like it. It was so brief, less than 2 minutes. He felt that he had failed. Lehman, his friend Ward Lehman, was sitting next to him on the stand. When he sat down, there was just a sprinkling of applause. And he said, Lehman, that speech won't scowl. That's what you say about a plow in the prairies when the mud doesn't come off it.
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. Chicago Times.
Dear Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Edward Everett.
Fourscore.
All right, here it is. And we need to listen to it now because it is very relevant today.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that their nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hear that? It's about the government. Government by, with, and for the people. America.
The Civil
is the
War
government.
began at 4:30 a.m. on the 12th of.
It is about the government, and people don't like the government. You need it. This is what the war was about, what those graveyards behind our campus is about, fighting for the government. And people hate the government these days. The government, we need some form of government to hold this country together. And that's what that graveyard's about. So it's for the government, by, with, and for the people. And too often these days, people hate the government, and it's imperfect. But we need some. Anyway, after the war, new technologies, the phonograph. You can, photography allowed you to see reality. The phonograph helped us hear it.
In over 100 years, we've never missed a payment. Guaranteed monthly income for life.
When school isn't a place you have to be, Why not go to school where remote learning can be as remote as you want?
The music industry as we know it today is a mere 100 years old. Its emergence and rise to power was all thanks to a little piece of metal called the acoustic horn. The inventor Thomas Edison was the first to successfully reproduce his voice in 1877 with his speaking machine, and thus ushered in the era of the phonogram. Hello, my dear polyphonic friends of harmony and sound. Welcome to It's History. I'm Brett, and today I want to explore in this series the wonderful world of sound recording. It all starts once again with Mr. Thomas Alva Edison. Now, when you hear the name Edison, people immediately think of the light bulb, one can say. And yes, that is exactly what we said in our last episode when we covered the history of that wonderful little invention. But there are many who do not know of the countless other inventions that spawned from the efforts of this industrious, self-educated American. This guy had his fingers in everything, among them the invention of sound recording. This is, of course, not to say that Edison was the only one to come up with the idea. Far from it. The desire to preserve one's own voice, whether through vanity or other reasons, is very old. There are documented attempts of people trying to do just this, which goes far back as the 10th century. So Edison was, in this respect, only faster than everyone else. Or, as he would say himself, I am more than a sponge than an inventor. I absorb ideas from every source. My principal business is giving commercial value to the brilliant but misdirected ideas of others. Thomas Edison created for himself a think tank in Menlo Park in New York. And with the idea of a speaking machine fresh in his mind, he gave a crude sketch of the device to his collaborator, John Cruzy, a Swiss immigrant, who later built the device that would, on the 21st of November, 1877, become the world's first voice recorder, which he named the phonograph. Edison's sketch presented Mr. Cruzy with a picture of tinfoil wrapped around a metal roll, much like the foil wrapped around chocolate Easter bunny eggs, that could be turned with the hand crank. Using an acoustic horn, the sound's vibrations would then become pressed against a membrane that would start to vibrate. This membrane was fitted to a steel needle that would carve the vibrations into the tinfoil as it turned. Edison's speaking machine was presented to a wider audience on the 6th of December, 1877, and boy, was everyone excited. Edison leaned over the flaring horn and spoke the following words of wisdom.
Hello, 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 Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere where Mary went, that lamb was sure to go. Ha, 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 ha.
It was now realized. He was the first man to hear his own voice speak back to him from a recording. The patent was filed on December 24th, and 1887 saw the first commercial production of the speaking machine. The main customers were mostly showmen who presented the device at fairs. This speaking machine caused a flurry of excitement at first, but then fizzled away quickly, and for good reason. Poor sound quality, and with no more than a minute to record, requiring frequent replacement of the cylinders. Disappointed by poor sales of his speaking machine that he later named the phonograph, Edison gave up his pursuit in voice recording and spent the next 10 years devoting himself to other inventions. But during this time, another inventor took on the task and, based on Edison's principles, revolutionized the technique of sound recording. Developed by Emil Berliner, a German from Hanover who immigrated to America, his device quickly became very popular and virtually set up the foundation for the record. On the 26th of December, 1887, Berliner patented his device that would record sound into discs. He called it a gramophone. Edison noticed a renewed interest along with improvements that were made in the sound recording technology, and up to 1890 attempted to upgrade his phonograph, but it still could not compete with the record. The key component to Berliner's innovation was that, unlike Edison, who recorded sound on a cylinder, Berliner recorded sound vibrations on a disc. On May 16, 1888, about 6 months after Edison's invention, Berliner presented his device to the public for the first time to an expert panel on the Franklin Institute of Philadelphia. Berliner also used the horn, membrane, and needle method to record. However, he also invented another kind of sound recording technique. He didn't carve the sound waves vertically onto a cylinder like Edison, but instead recorded the sound from left to right using horizontal modulation of the needle as it traced its line along the rotating disc with a thin coating of soot. Berliner's method improved sound quality considerably. Directly after the recording process, the soot was varnished and then used to photo-engrave its equivalent grooves onto a metal disc. The discs had an average diameter of 25 to 30 centimeters and could be played at a speed of 78 RPMs. However, a major drawback emerged from Berliner's method. The disc could only be used to play sounds once they were recorded and could not be used to record from again, since the grooves of the disc projected inward. Thus, the records could only be made one at a time, which the artist found to be unacceptable as they were forced to play the same song over and over again. Berliner continued to experiment and came up with a solution in 1895. He replaced the black layer of carbon with a massive sheet of wax, which he then electroplated, resulted in a negative record with grooves projecting outward and not inward that he could use to stamp positive copies with. Electroplating is a physical process which goes all the way back to the Italian physicist Luigi Galvani that uses electric current to change the surface properties of an object. With this process, copper plates could finally be reproduced at will. For these copper plates, Berliner used a material composed of around 70% stone dust and 30% shellac, resulting in the so-called shellac discs. On the subject of shellac, for those like me who never heard of it before, it's a resin secreted from the female lac insect. Now, this parasite has its home in Burma, India, and Thailand and loves to feed on the sap of lacquer trees. Now, these sophisticated bugs protect their eggs by covering the branches with a 3 to 10 millimeter thick layer full of shellac. Just so you know. It required a Hungarian physicist who immigrated to America named Peter Karl Goldmark to turn the record into the LP that we know today. Now, Goldmark developed a record made of plastic vinyl that could be recorded on both sides. Now, he presented his development on the 21st of June, 1948 at a distributor meeting in Atlantic City, which he patented under the name LP, standing for Long Playing Record. For those of you who love figures, Goldmark's record had a diameter of 30 centimeters and were set at—
Well, you get the point that a lot of people were involved in the creation of the phonograph. Edison originally started with the wax cylinder, but Berliner made it practical and Goldmark made it modern. And then we have the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, or so you think.
Place your first bet risk-free and get up to $1,000 back if you don't win.
Das Pferd frisst keinen Gurkensalat, translated as the horse does not eat cucumber salad. These are the most famous words in connection with a unique invention that has become indispensable in our daily lives. What was first dismissed as a pointless toy, its potential was quickly recognized by some clever minds. This invention is responsible for the largest patent dispute in history. We are talking about the telephone. Hello, my dear friends of Encrypted Communication. I'm Brett, and a very big welcome to another episode of It's History. Now, every country has its telephone inventor. The French have Charles Bousseau, who in 1854 described a telephone but never built the thing. The Italians have their theater technician and candlestick maker, Antonio Meucci, who in 1871 drew up a blueprint for a phone, but it never became anything more. And then there's the good old American Elisha Gray, who turned in his patent just a little bit too late. Nonetheless, the invention of the telephone has become closely associated with two other names. Alexander Graham Bell, the one who everyone knows, and Johann Philipp Reis, the name who maybe only a few of you know. Two super intelligent people whose biographies could not be any more different. One was a son of a professor of rhetoric, and at the age of 10 entered a private school in Edinburgh, Scotland. Later, he would come to study Latin and Greek. By the age of 17, Alexander Graham Bell became a teacher of elocution and music in Elgin, also in Scotland. The other was the son of a baker and became an orphan by the age of 10. By the virtue of his circumstances, he could not find himself anything more than a commercial apprenticeship. However, Johann Philipp Reis can be counted as one of the most important pioneers of the telephone. A feat all the more impressive considering he acquired all of his knowledge through self-study. Reis was one of the first persons to send a word by an electrical wire. His most productive period as an inventor began about 1858 in a boys' boarding school in Friedrichsdorf. Surprisingly, the inventor received a job as a teacher of French, physics, mathematics, and chemistry. With whatever little time he had left to spare, he spent inside a barn he had converted into a lab. While he had brilliant ideas, they did not achieve what he had hoped for. Inventions such as the velocipede, an early form of the bicycle, or roller skates, the forerunner of today's inline skates, did not find large audiences. Asphalt and concrete were just not that popular back then. The idea of his most important invention, the telephone, was inspired from a physics lesson where he had built a model of the human ear. He carved the external parts of the ear out of wood, and the eardrum he made out of a piece of pig intestine. Having already experimented in his laboratory with electricity and was familiar with Samuel Morse's telegraph, he came to the idea that he could reproduce sound of all kinds by the galvanic current at any distance. From those of you who are not familiar familiar, the sound produced through galvanic current is the result of a natural resonance that is reproduced when an iron rod is placed inside the hollow of an insulated wire with the current being continuously interrupted. His voice transmission was based on the conversation of sound waves into electrical signals with the help of membranes whose vibrations interrupt the circuit. These pulses became then transmitted through a line and then translated back into sound waves through an amplified wooden sound box into a sort of noise that could be identified as speech signals. He presented his invention before the Forum of the Physical Society in Frankfurt am Main on the 26th of October, 1861, under what was the unwieldy title, "On the Reproduction of Musical Sounds to Any Distance Through the Medium of Galvanic Current." He called his device the telephone. During his demonstration, the words that he spoke into the device at one end were clearly reproduced at the other. "The horse does not eat cucumber salad." Rice chose this strange phrase because, well, it makes no sense, so therefore no one could guess what the next word would be. News of the invention spread quickly, and Rice gave demonstrations of his new device to both the Emperor of Austria and the King Max of Bavaria. Rice's phones were shipped for scientific purposes on long trips up to Tbilisi and the Caucasus. But as like his other inventions, his telephone came out just too darn early, and the importance was overlooked. It was simply seen as a plaything for physics. While living long enough to become intensely embittered and resentful, on January 14th, 1874, Philip Rice died of pulmonary tuberculosis in Friedrichsdorf at the age of 40. Alexander Graham Bell had much more luck than Rice. On the 14th of February, 1876, he registered his phone at the U.S. Patent Office. He and his two brothers, while students in Edinburgh, Scotland, had already been experimenting with Rice's apparatus since 1862. They had found several improvements. Apart from the miserable sound quality of Rice's phone that would squeak more than speak, the device would only transmit in one direction. Because of this, it was not really suitable for everyday use. After the early death of his two brothers to tuberculosis, Alexander Graham Bell made further developments to the phone. In 1870, the family moved to Canada, and in addition to his job as a teacher of the deaf, he devoted himself to further development of the phone. Well, since Bell had only his holidays and Sunday evenings to work on his project, he pulled in the engineer Thomas A. Watson to help him out. Bell did not conceal the fact that he had studied the works of Philip Rice, but Rice was not the only source from which he drew his information. The Italian-American Antonio Meucci had filed a patent for a telephone 5 years before, in 1871, but the request was denied because poor Meucci couldn't pay for the processing fee. Bell apparently worked in the former workshops of Meucci, and with Meucci's records and Meucci's own equipment, Bell developed his own phone. During this time, Meucci demanded that he have his plans back, but Bell said that they were lost. Meucci took Bell to court, but as is the case time and time again throughout history, the one without enough money could not stand up to the injustices caused by those who did. Meucci died an impoverished man, and it was only after his death that the U.S. authorities issued a fraud case against Bell. But it gets even more interesting and juicy. Only 2 hours after Bell submitted his patent, in came the American physicist Elisha Gray, his closest rival for the rights over the invention. Gray had teamed up with the Western Union Telegraph Company, then the largest cable company in the US. His patent was of a better design than that of Bell's, and over the next few years, about 600 trials were held against Bell's patent, which finally went up before the Supreme Court. But thanks to his stepfather, who represented him as a patent attorney, Bell was allowed to continue to profit from his work. Bell's patent of 1876 would become one of the most profitable property rights of all time. In 1877, he founded the Bell Telephone Company that spawned one of the large.
That is one of the Bell's greatest inventions, not just the phone, but the phone company. As you see, a lot of people were working on something similar, and that'll happen again and again and again. The one who gets the credit is the one who gets the patent. And then he took the patent and he made the phone company so you could use the phone. It's one thing to have this thing to play with, but then to connect them, he invented the phone company, which was called the Bell system. Even
largest telephone communication companies of our.
It's AT&T today. It was the Bell system when I was a kid. So if you have AT&T, it's Alexander Graham Bell.
day AT&T. By the end of the 19th century, there were over 230,000 telephone lines connected by over 500,000 miles of wire throughout the United States. When Alexander Graham Bell died on August 1st, 1922, all phone communication in North America was cut off for a minute to honor the man. In 1877, Bell's device made it all the way to Germany. And on the 19th of November, the German postmaster ordered the construction of telegraph wires that would include telephone capabilities. According to a survey by the International Telecommunication Union.
So you have all of these inventions happening after the Civil War. What difference does that make? All of a sudden, we're wired, y'all. You have big media, you have telephones and telegraphs, and so soon as something happens, boom, you read about it in the press. One of the biggest things that happened was the Spanish-American War. I'll show you a little bit about that.
It has been written that the pen is mightier than the sword. Perhaps it's because the pen has the ability to summon the sword. Colonial newspapers filled with opinion pieces written by the likes of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine helped mobilize Americans for the Revolutionary War. The American media would rapidly evolve from these small localized chains to become a multi-million-dollar business equivalent to millions of pens. Through the newspapers the printing press turned out, the world got its foot to become a multi-million-dollar business.
All about that.
For
You've heard of the Yellow Press? That's called the Yellow Kid. It's kind of like Alfred E. Newman. Don't say nothing. He was a cartoon character. When you call the Yellow Press, that's
William
him.
Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, mass media meant mass profit. The circulation war between these two men demonstrated that the media leads the nation for better or for worse. Pulitzer and Hearst would leave a legacy in blood and ink and show how war can be brought from print to presence. Joseph Pulitzer was born in Mako, Hungary on April 10, 1847. After gaining American citizenship in the Civil War, Pulitzer moved to Missouri, where he would take over the Vestal Post and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Pulitzer took the profits from these papers and, with the help of his brother Albert Pulitzer, purchased the New York World from railroad baron Jay Gould in 1883. The World quickly rose to prominence by securing the election of Grover Cleveland in 1884. New York was a swing state that would decide the election, and as Pulitzer biographer James Morris would write, electing Cleveland and boosting circulation were completely intertwined, the latter increasing the former. Pulitzer put his aggressive style of journalism on display through the political assassination of Republican candidate James Blaine. He explained his philosophy by writing, "The most valuable and successful paper will generally be that which has the most enemies." Pulitzer would use his vicious muckraking to make the World the most widely circulated newspaper in America. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863, to U.S. Senator George Hearst. Pulitzer's success at the New York World inspired Hearst to drop out of college and take over the San Francisco Examiner from his father, giving it the title the Monarch of Dailies. Hearst quickly moved to acquire the greatest talents of his time, including Ambrose Bierce, Mark Twain, Jack London, and political cartoonist Homer Davenport. In 1895, Albert Pulitzer refused to sell the New York Morning Journal to his brother, instead opting to sell his paper to Hearst, who renamed it simply the New York Journal. The circulation war between Hearst and Pulitzer was ultimately a contest between competing philosophies.
Hearst believed in journalism of action. So he thought that the newspaper itself should bring about social change, social action in very concrete ways. Pulitzer sort of believed that too, but not the sort of inserting the newspaper into stories. Pulitzer's paper is doing some hardcore investigative work. So, his paper not only investigates that, but they make it into a crusade. They beat that story each and every day like a drum until there's change.
With that, the stage was set for the bitter birth of yellow journalism. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1888, both papers immediately jumped to treachery. For a week following the sinking, the journal dedicated an average of 8.5 pages to the sinking of the USS Maine. Hearst even went so far.
Yes, Battleship Maine blown up in Havana Harbor. What happened is American sailors were rolling their own next to the powder magazine where all the gunpowder was. The ship blew up. Guess what? Must be those terrible Spanish. Must be those foreigners blowing up our ship. We need a war. And so they went to war, and the country, again, as I said, Hearst said, give me the story, I'll give you the war. Hearst gave you the war. He gave the politicians a reason to go to war, and you have a war. A war needs a hero. Here we have Teddy Roosevelt. Famous picture there, charging up San Juan Hill. Guess what? It's a lie. He did not charge up San Juan Hill, he walked. But you see this picture in the press of the guy who led our soldiers up San Juan Hill. The interesting thing, it was a unit of Buffalo soldiers, African-American soldiers, who really did the fighting, and he followed them up the hill. He took the credit. He became governor, he became vice president, and then president. Anyway, okay, this is pretty repetitious.
This is the checkers game where
But I'll show you
grandson
one other
and
little thing to think about is
Professor Dave again.
scandal,
Let's learn
a
about
sex
Grover
scandal
Cleveland.
in those days.
Stephen Grover Cleveland was the 22nd and 24th president, the first and only to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office. He won the popular vote in 3 presidential elections in 1884, 1888, and 1892, and was one of 2 Democrats with Woodrow Wilson to be elected president during the era of Republican political domination, dating from...
Yes, okay, that's Grover Cleveland. The big thing was...
Though Cleveland was renowned for his honesty, the Republicans found a skeleton in his closet, alleging during the 1884 campaign that he had fathered an illegitimate child. During their rallies, they would chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" When confronted with the scandal, Cleveland immediately admitted responsibility. His direct admission diffused the potential scandal, and ultimately it did him little harm. Meanwhile, the GOP candidate, James Blaine, had hoped to attract...
My point is, the personal life of our politicians was in the media even then. So you have a lot of modern things happening. So in the 1800s, the media started to look modern. You have new technologies, you have scandals, you have war. The media becomes powerful. Next time, we'll talk about what we did with that power. People got a little scared of the big media. And that's what happens in the 20th century. We'll talk about that next time. And then we'll move on to other stuff and finish up our unit on the history of media. Thank you, those of you who are here. Otherwise, have a lovely day, and we will talk to you soon. And I'll post a question on all of this shortly.